We will not have succeeded in solving the affordability divide. In fact, no country took a larger step backwards than the United States when it let the Affordable Connectivity Program expire.
Welcome to another episode of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. It's 2025, and we're going to kick it off with Blair Levin, former director of the National Broadband Plan, former chief of staff at the Federal Communications Commission, currently an equities analyst at New Street Research, and general seer of internet-related things. Welcome back to the show, Blair.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good to see you, and Happy New Year.
Yes, likewise. So we're going to talk about what we expect. We're going to keep it relatively tight for you and I, less than an hour. And I have to say that as I was moving around this morning, Spotify picked out for me the song by Tom Petty, "It's Time to Move On, Time to Get Going. What Lies Ahead, I Have No Way of Knowing," and felt very accurate for this year.
You know, one of the things that really cracks me up is that everybody in DC, they say things like, you can't predict the future. And I kind of want to say to them, you know, like for 25 years, people have been paying me a decent salary to do exactly that. You may not be accurate, you may not be right. And you have to know what you have a high confidence in and what you have a low confidence in. But yeah, you probably know what's ahead. I think we can make reasonable guesses.
I mean, that's the thing is I feel like I have more low confidence and very few high confidence. My high confidence is just that anything could happen, which isn't a very good high confidence prediction.
No, I don't think that's right, actually.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting when you look in the fullness of time, generally speaking, when we're talking about the networks, they're the same networks owned by the same people that we had approximately when the 1996 Act passed. And my history goes back to then, and a lot of my reflections are about that. On the other hand, in terms of the most popular apps, totally different. In terms of the devices, BlackBerry, gone. Nokia, gone. You know, so there are certain things where there's very significant changes. But my guess is a year from now, the most powerful networks are the most powerful networks. Starlink probably will have more customers, but it's not really going to be material to most Americans.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what I'm thinking of is I feel like when I look around at people's predictions, and I've been saying this, and I feel like people think it's because I have a certain political mindset, which is super jumbled anyway. But at any rate, I think there's a decent chance that the BEAD program is just tossed out unlawfully and there's no consequences for doing it. I hope we don't see that happen, but that's where for me, and I don't think you share that agreement. I think you disagree with me on that. But I feel like a lot of people are not paying attention to some of the ways in which, and it may not happen in telecom, but I think there are going to be very big surprises as to things that we all thought was settled, ways of doing business are going to change. And
I would agree with that on other things. I mean, the biggest question mark in a way is the tariffs. And I hear things all over the place in that. Another big question mark is mass deportation. And, there is a view among a lot of people that one of the geniuses of Donald Trump as a politician is to convince people that he's only going to do the things that they like, that he says he's going to do.
Right.
But the things he says he's going to do that they don't like, he's not really going to do them. I hear this all the time on Wall Street. He's not really going to do tariffs. He's not really going to deport 10 million people, that kind of stuff. That part I agree with you on, a little unpredictable.
And if we can just talk about this neutrally, I don't know how many people we've already lost, but but I think it's worth going back to the first term and saying he campaigned on building the wall. He modestly expanded the wall, and he got credit for building the wall among his supporters. And the question is, will that be the same sort of thing for tariffs and for deportations, which we are talking about because it has a material impact on broadband deployment and the economics around broadband?
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be my most likely guess, is that there will be some small amount of tariffs and some small number of deportations, and they will talk about it as though it is a significant amount, and they will move on and do other things. with some tail risk that they would be doing much more of that. And then that would then be very disruptive to the industry, is what I'm expecting.
Yeah. So I'm going to agree with you on the deportations. It's going to be far less than the 10 million. And there are lots of different reasons for that. The thing about tariffs is you can look at it from an economic perspective, you can look at it from a national security perspective, but Trump tends to look at things totally from a personal leverage perspective. And nothing would give the president more leverage than to say, okay, here's a baseline 10% for everybody. Now you come kiss the ring and to ask me whether I should increase your competitor's tariff to 30% and decrease yours to zero, right? And we saw that in the first term where Republican aligned firms got breaks on the tariffs and Democratic firms got less. But so I tend to have more of a political analysis of that. But that's a low confidence thing. And I do think that one thing that's really interesting and important is to watch the bond market. The bond market is not believing that America is going to be great again and inflation is going down, right? And if it goes up even higher, I think, the bond vigilantes are going to be the adults in the room in terms of controlling some of what obviously I have policy instincts, but just from a Wall Street analysis point of view, I think that's a critical element to watch.
We're going to dive into specific communications issues in a minute, but the last thing I want to say about that is the thing that I find not enough people take seriously, which is the way these things can spiral. And I think what you said regarding President Trump being able to individually negotiate with different firms about tariffs. I mean, Apple, I think, is perhaps a canonical example. They found a way to make sure they were exempted from it in their first term.
Right.
If other countries decide to start using export tariffs to respond, that's where things, I think, can just sort of escalate beyond where President Trump is the one setting the agenda.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's where I just feel like a lot of people forget that there's a two-way street with tariffs, and perhaps people will be so intimidated that they won't do that. But there's ways in which those things can spiral out of control and get beyond any one individual's ability to manipulate them.
I think anyone who reads the history of the Depression would have to agree with you. The Great Depression of the 30s, yeah.
Okay, so can we expect the Federal Communications Commission to dive in February and try to really adjust pull attachment rates to increase investment and start a proceeding to fix the Universal Service Fund? Is that something that we'll see in the cards?
So, one of the great things about Brendan Carr as chair, from my perspective, is he's pretty clear about what his priorities are. And I'll get to those two things, but those are not what he's been focused on. The number one thing he's been focused on is the so-called censorship cartel represented by tech. And we could chat about that, but fundamentally, he sent a letter in November to Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Meta, asking questions about their use of a firm called NewsGuard, which rates news sites. And I would say if you look at that correspondence, I'm struck by a couple things. Number one, what jurisdiction does he have here? Number two, what is he really trying to do? Number three, how is this deregulatory? It goes to what you were saying about the wall. You forgot the fact that Mexico was supposed to pay for it.
I just didn't want to get into it.
Yeah. Trump and MAGA, again, I give them credit for a certain kind of political brilliance, even if I find it very problematic from a country's long-term point of view. They're very good at choosing their enemies and getting people to believe that he may not accomplish it, but at least he's attacking the right people. In fact, I think Vance said, our people hate the right people. I have to say that's a very disturbing thing to me from kind of an ethical and religious point of view, but from a political point of view, I think that's right. And I think what Carr is doing is saying that the enemy is big tech. Okay.
Big tech is fascinating to me. We just had X censor a bunch of Donald Trump's biggest fans and nobody cared. So let's just be very clear about what's happening here. This is not at all about censorship. It could not be more clear when that happened. Yes. Yeah. So, okay. So your second thing, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I should have mentioned that. I find Carr's letter problematic in a variety of ways. And now I'm not speaking as an analyst, Because as an analyst, I would simply say it'll have no impact on those four companies. But if we're going to go to what my own policy preferences are, that wouldn't be the North Star of telecommunications policy is the censorship cartel. But you see the head of the FTC saying that too, and it's part of a larger kind of MAGA theme. A second theme is that uh, the broadcasters should be held to a public interest standard, and he wants to revive it. Now, this actually does have implications for communications, but they're kind of a cushion shot. But he's currently reviewing the Skydance Paramount deal and basically saying, gee, I don't know, it's really problematic. They were their news coverage way too pro-democratic. Stephen Colbert's jokes are, much more about Republicans than Democrats. It's totally unfair. Well, I agree that we should have a vibrant public interest standard. The problem with what he's doing is it appears that he's only doing it in the area of transactions where he has very high authority to do whatever he wants, as opposed to having a rulemaking where if you actually wrote a rule that said your news coverage can't be too biased one way or another, he would destroy Sinclair Broadcasting and Salem Broadcasting, one a television, a local affiliate group, the other a radio group, who are, they are like Fox News, which is a cable channel. So that's a complicated thing, but he has gone on to say that he wants to support local affiliates in their battles to get more compensation from the big networks. And here is where we get into broadband, because what you're essentially saying is that the broadband providers who are generally also MVPDs, that is to say they deliver multi-channel video programming, they're going to have to pay more.
Right. But no, if for anyone who's gotten into broadband in the past 10 years, certainly the last 5, I don't even think they know the relationship between local broadcasters and what they were required to pay for and how those relationships work. I don't know if you have a 30-second explainer on that that could help.
Well, if you go back to the 80s, basically what you had was the big cable companies, they controlled what the content was, and they got a piece of the action. That is to say, the large cable company, then TCI, owned a piece of CNN, and they owned a piece of this, and they owned a piece of everything. In the Cable Act of 92, Congress said, no, the cable providers, they can own a piece, but they have to offer the programming on equal terms to competitors to cable. And that destroyed cable's interest in owning the programming. It didn't make sense anymore because the whole purpose of having ownership was to control who got it. But then they were selling these very large packages. The big change came with Netflix. And suddenly you have people subscribing to apps, Netflix, Apple TV, Apple Plus, Amazon Prime, but now Disney Plus, Peacock, Paramount, and the number of people who subscribe to these big cable channel bundles has gone down. And what you're going to see next year is a real reconfiguration of the media industry, partly driven by policy, but mostly driven by markets. But it's going to affect the way we use broadband. It's going to affect the economics of broadband as well.
And so you think that or not you think, there is a virtual certainty that in the future, Comcast will not be distributing linear television programming over its network. The question is at what point that will happen, right?
That's
And
right.
we're not expecting it to happen this year. There's an outside chance it might, in part based on some of these different factors.
Well, on Wall Street, there's a concept known as a melting ice cube, a business that is time limited. It will eventually go away. And what Wall Street is betting on is how many more years does it have? If the market thinks this ice cube will melt in 5 years, and you think it'll melt in 3, you short it. If you think it'll melt in 10, you buy it, right? And private equity is likely to buy a number of assets that Wall Street considers melting ice cubes because they still produce a lot of cash, and they're betting on the amount of time. But at some time in the future, will there be kind of the big bundles sold by the multi-channel video providers, distributors? No, that's going to go away. Linear television will eventually go away, but it will take a long time.
And so for people who are tracking that, media ownership and issues around media ownership, and also some of these claims about censorship could change the regulations, which will change the incentives of how this programming is distributed, changing that whole market in ways that are difficult to forecast, and how it will change the melting ice cube.
That's right. That's right. But you already see this. Comcast is spinning off their cable channels. There's lots of expectations on Wall Street that group of channels will somehow align with Warner channels and maybe Paramount, and you have this super group. It's very much like you push a balloon somewhere, the air goes somewhere else. That business model is fundamentally not attractive to the consumers in the way that it was. And incoming chair Carr wants to help local affiliates in their negotiations with the big networks. I understand why he's doing it, but whether he'll succeed or whether he'll simply actually accelerate the end of linear television, I don't know.
And this gets into a question that I think is important. I raise it frequently among friends of mine, allies on the left on certain issues, where I feel like there's a difference between really wanting to achieve something and being seen doing something in
Yeah.
the short term. And that's where I feel like we would expect to see kind of half-hearted, not well thought out policy initiatives on some of these matters, as someone like Chairman Carr, I don't think is deeply committed to gutting the First Amendment in order to for a particular point of view. I think he wants to increase his standing among people who see that as important right now. And so he doesn't have a 10-year plan for doing this. He has a 1 or 2 year plan for doing it. And the consequences of that could be difficult to guess.
Motive is always hard, right? And we tend to judge other people by their actions, ourselves by our motives, because we're always well motivated. But we sometimes attribute bad motives. And I don't want to get into that too much. I'll simply say what was interesting about a letter that he wrote Disney is that he defined the problem in a way that he can go after Disney, Comcast, and Paramount. Huh. Is it a coincidence that those are the three companies that own the three national news providers that Donald Trump has said should lose their licenses? But it doesn't include Fox. Interesting. But I think on that, Brendan is a very smart, able guy. He's been on the commission a long time. I think he will be consequential in terms of what he does. But one of the things he does better than anyone else currently on the commission, and possibly as well as anyone ever, is he uses the power of the bully pulpit. He was enormously successful in talking about TikTok and getting congressional support to ban it. Now, of course, since Trump changed his mind, Carr has been quiet on that topic.
Well, let me make the point in a different way. How many people listening to this show can name the second Republican commissioner on the FCC right now?
I listen to the show and I can.
I don't know how often that name Simonton has been in the news compared to Carr, but it's certainly been far less frequently. Okay, we've talked about media ownership. I think the only time we really talk about Dish is when you're on here, but I want you to make the case of why people who are concerned about broadband deployment have an interest in what happens with Dish in the next year.
So I would say, Dish is the most important company for markets. And what I mean by that is if you believe they're going to succeed, your view of everything else is different. If you believe they're going to fail, your view of everything else. If you have a fourth wireless provider, that changes the competitive intensity of the market. And since now wireless is to some extent competing with fixed, not entirely, but to some extent, it goes throughout the market. And Ergen is very much a disruptor. The general view of Wall Street is that it will not succeed, that the effort will go into bankruptcy and it'll be broken up and sold for parts. But even that is significant because as we look at the future of spectrum, the biggest portfolio of spectrum that may become available in some way would be the Dish portfolio of spectrum. So we'll see what happens. I think under the Democrats, you would have seen a lot of accommodation in terms of build out requirement timing and things like that. And in fact, the Democrats did extend that build out requirement um, to do everything they can to help him succeed. There is some point of view that it doesn't matter what the government does, it's simply not going to work. He's too late to the game. I don't trust my level of knowledge to make a prediction about that. But what I do know is that whatever way it goes, there'll be a cascading effect in the market. And I would say for broadband generally, Brendan Carr nor the Democrats have any plan for increasing competitive intensity in the market other than Dish. And this again, by the way, is very different than the world as we saw it in 1996, where we thought we could increase competitive intensity in every sector. And we were right. Back then, cable was very isolated from the telcos who were isolated from long distance and lots of different reasons for that. But that massive change, taking single purpose networks, voice, video, data, and making them all basically data networks in which voice and video are just applications, absolutely increase the competitive intensity. This is it. There is no other plan.
Well, this is something that I was thinking about the other day because over break I took some time to figure out how to play a certain video game with some of my friends virtually, and would just sit there on an open telephone call for hours playing this game, chatting with them and stuff like that. Didn't go to the effort of setting up a Discord or something else to get around it because phone calls are basically free now for most of us.
This is what we're doing right now is free.
Right.
You know, I am old enough to have gone to the World's Fair in 1964 as a 10-year-old. And one of the big things was the AT&T video phone call. $3 a minute is what they were saying.
Which was really expensive then.
Which was really expensive then. And the notion that we're essentially now doing this for free.
Right. And this gets to something I was, when I was scheduling this out, I was like, I don't think we're going to be able to get into this. And I would like to dig into this more with you at some point. There's a couple of things you said there, and it just sort of crossed over with Benton recently had a piece in their Digital Beat looking at the 2024 competition report from the FCC. And you said in the beginning of this segment about Dish that mobile is competing with fixed. And certainly mobile has taken more away from fixed than we would have expected. But these numbers are a year old. And I seem to recall it was well less than 10%. It might have been 8% that had mobile broadband for internet. And now it might be approaching 10%. I would say that when we have this fight, if we do again about whether they're complementary or not, I still feel like mobile is not truly competitive with fixed.
Well, I think there are a couple of different elements. One is, to what extent are people going to say, I've got essentially broadband on my phone. I don't need it anywhere else. And
people without children, and there's a number of cases in which they'll do that, but I think that's certain people will have a higher propensity to do that than others, and I don't feel like that's the general population yet.
I completely agree. A second question is, to what extent will fixed wireless broadband compete with fixed wired broadband? And that's a big debate on Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is it going like this? Is it going like this? Is it going like this?
Let the record show Blair making different graph shapes.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. In other words, is it up and to the right? Is it flatlining, or is it going up and then going down?
Mm-hmm.
And I can make a case for all three of them. But the third thing, and this is, again, a little bit outside of my lane, is to what extent does the presence of that kind of service provide a competitive impact on the way that fixed wireline broadband providers price their product? So, but here's my big point. What is the FCC strategy for increasing competitive intensity?
Right. So before you actually raise that, I pulled out two other stats, which I thought were interesting. And again, they're a year old. From 2022 to 2023, the percentage of households with at least 3 provider options for 100 down, 20 up megabits per second service increased from approximately 19% to approximately 29%. And then as of December 23rd, approximately 66% of households had at least two options for services meeting at least 100 by 20. And approximately 7% of households had two options for services that were roughly a gigabit down. And I guess the question from that I wanted to raise with you was, is this success? Like we have achieved success with the telephone and with many other services, but I feel like the Telecommunications Act's vision for broadband is nowhere close to a reality yet.
I'm going to disagree with you, but since I was in a lot of rooms, I would say when you say what was the vision of the 96 Act, as I think Anton Scalia said in one of the court cases that went there, the act was a model of ambiguity. And the reason it was a model of ambiguity is because, as one senator once said to my boss, the chair of the FCC, well, here's what we did, Reed. We put in everything that somebody wanted, and then we put in everything that somebody else wanted. You figure it out. This is not exactly, you could say, well, that's not the way Congress should work. Okay, fine. That is the way Congress works, uses ambiguity. So the question you're raising is what was the North Star of the 96 Act? And it really was, let's open it up to competition. Big question mark. We know how to allow local phone companies to compete with long distance? How do we get long distance to compete with local? And that was the 14-point checklist and stuff like that. You could say, well, it turned out the long distance guys all got bought up and therefore it wasn't a success. And, we did our best to try to make it life possible for the long distance guys to succeed. And maybe we did a good job, maybe we did a bad job. We could go down a real rabbit hole of what really happened. But at the end of the day, the cable guys are now competing with the telcos. And there are, in a lot of places, CLECs, and then you have wireless. I Look, again, we couldn't do what we're doing right now in 1996. I think we opened the door to that. I think there were a couple of key moments. One of the most important moments that nobody knows about was when we said that the wireline guys had to interconnect with the wireless guys at actual cost, which was zero. And that was when wireless went from being a niche service of doctors and plumbers to a general service, where I think 98% of the adult population now is a cell phone. That was not true in 1996.
Right. No, and it couldn't have been. But the way I look at it is not looking back at like, did they screw up or didn't they? It's more like the 1996 Act threw a bunch of new tools out there. And we've seen, I think, the vision of robust competition and investment in some areas. In other areas, I feel like those tools have not been used as properly, or they've been used more defensively. And my point in raising it is that what got us into this is you were talking about competitive intensity, and that's where I feel like we're going, right? I mean, as we roll out of 2024 into 2025, we're more or less moving away from a discussion about people who don't have access, and we're moving into a
Well,
discussion.
people don't have access is different than competitive intensity. When I talk about competitive intensity, I'm talking about, 90% of the public when we're talking about people who don't have access.
Precisely.
And I feel, let's just say a mid-level confidence, sometime in 2025, then President Trump and Elon Musk will declare we succeeded. Everyone is now connected. Now, whether that's through BEAD, it's through Starlink, whatever, they will declare victory.
And they will be largely correct, right? I mean, like, that's the point that I'm making, is that we are moving in that direction where we can all agree the problem is not primarily one of the number of families who have been left behind without a physical infrastructure option. The problem, from my point of view, is people who are not able to take full advantage. The problem, from other people's point of view, may be a lack of competition or those sorts of things. These things are interrelated. And I think that's where we're moving. And that's what you're talking about.
I agree with you that what we should think of as the access divide, we're going to declare victory and that we solved it. Now, that has a lot of implications for the restructuring of universal service. Maybe that's interesting to people, maybe it's not. We will not have succeeded in solving the affordability divide. In fact, no country took a larger step backwards than the United States when it let the Affordable Connectivity Program expire. But I see very little political pressure on the Republicans in the House and Senate or on Trump to address that affordability divide. I might note that I had an editorial I co-authored in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago saying that the DOGE thing that Musk is doing, they should look at closing literally thousands of offices, Veterans Affairs, Social Security, Department of Labor, a bunch of others. They were basically customer services offices. They were set up in the 30s, 40s, 50s. They did great work.
For people to go there in person to receive services.
Right. But now the private sector is doing almost all of that work online. And in fact, with AI, it's better to do it online. But what I say there is when they do that, they should take some of the savings and make sure we have something like an ACP program. Let me confess that I care a lot more about the ACP program than about, I mean, this is not Blair equity analyst. This is Blair, former director of the National Broadband Plan, who just looks at, okay, that problem got solved. That problem got solved. This one didn't. Let's solve this problem. I am trying to get the affordable connectivity program with my very limited resources and megaphone back on the table to be discussed. And I would just note, and the three Democrats at the FCC, to me, sadly, have done nothing to make it a more politically viable thing. And what I'm trying to do there is, here's a way to pay for it, guys.
Yes.
Yeah. Having said that, do I think that's going to happen? No. Do I wish it would happen? Yes.
I mean, so this all gets wrapped up into USF. We've talked about that so much. I don't want to spend a lot of time. We're waiting. We'll maybe have you back on in June when we're getting the decision from the Supreme Court regarding the Fifth Circuit decision. But one of the other areas in which there is a pool of money, and for people who aren't familiar with policy, if you really want to solve an issue, you often have to identify a pool of money with which to tap to get it. You've talked before about sports betting and the danger that is causing. We have seen analyses from ProPublica, I think, among others, about the danger. I think New York Times may have done a piece on the rising rates of domestic abuse, of male suicides, a variety of impacts from putting betting so rapidly at our fingertips, particularly us men and young men at that. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to tie these things together if you want to.
Yeah, I actually gave a speech about this a couple of years ago. It's curious to me, Brendan Carr, Congressman Gallagher, historian Niall Ferguson, lots of other Republicans referred to TikTok as digital fentanyl. Now, there's all the kinds of national security issues and some other things, privacy issues, but let's focus on the digital fentanyl. That is a very strong allegation, but it might be right because what we see in social media is a lot of we see the impact very troubling in lots of ways. And you see countries like Australia, I think New Zealand, banning it, social media for kids. You see states doing it. By the way, something else I'll predict comfortably, the states will be much more active in communications regulation this year than they have been in the past. And they certainly are the major ones doing social media regulation. And I actually agree with a lot of these things. This is not to ban social media. It is to regulate it in a way in which you reduce the harm to children, right? We do this with cigarettes. We do this with alcohol. We do this with other kinds of things. Well, sports gambling, it's curious. It seems to me to be so much more destructive to so many more people and very clearly. So number one, we should tax it more as we do cigarettes and alcohol.
If I developed a addiction to opioids, my wife, children, and parents would probably notice. If I develop a problem with sports betting, the evidence suggests they may not notice. There may not be any signs of it. And so that's just one of the ways in which these things can get far worse. So
100%. They will notice it when they go to the bank account and suddenly there is nothing there. They will notice it when you become an abusive person, though I know you well enough to know that you won't. But it's astonishing to me that it is probably the biggest problem on our phones and over our communications network, and yet nobody is talking about that. But they are talking about things that I agree we should talk about, but they're a lesser harm.
Scott Galloway has put it on the agenda. I think 2025 will be a year in which, as you've mentioned, we'll see some friction developing from cell phone companies or different entities that have a point to introduce some friction. I do think that may start to happen here. I think it's people are starting to pay attention to it. You had mentioned state regulation, net neutrality, and seems to be done at the federal level for some time.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, at the state level, it could be alive. And similarly, the shocker to me, the state of New York is able to impose I think, well-designed program requiring a $15 a month plan on many ISPs. That's something I think we'll see other states. Is that what you had in mind when you think states will be getting more involved?
Yeah, on both levels. California has a net neutrality regime. It was upheld by the Ninth Circuit. The New York low income provisions have been upheld by the Second Circuit. The Supreme Court didn't take cert. I think a number of blue states will look at doing those kinds of things. I'll make another prediction, which is if enough blue states do it, the ISPs will go to the Congress and say, you must adopt laws that preempt the states, but the only way to do that is to essentially have some federal regulation in both of those areas. But here's the thing you can't do, which is what Ajit Pai tried to do with his order. He said, we have no jurisdiction over broadband except the jurisdiction to preempt states from them doing anything about broadband. It doesn't work that way. And the court, I think in an almost whimsical way, said, no, we'll agree with you under Chevron deference that you don't have authority here, but that doesn't mean you have authority to preempt states.
Yeah, one of my biggest frustrations is that the idea that Section 253 is not sufficiently clear that Congress is preempting the states. But the fact that Congress has to be very clear in preempting the states gives us a little bit of cover in other areas as well.
That's right. Look, I mean, here's the thing about the major question doctrine, which lots of people immediately said, this is great because this will hurt regulators and it'll mean that Congress really has to act. Well, Congress isn't going to act. I mean, we not for a long time. If Congress isn't acting, that almost automatically says states can act. Now, the Interstate Commerce Clause plays into this a little bit, but I think state action is when we're talking about real impact. That's where we're going to see it in the next year.
Spectrum super important. Not a ton of spectrum available to hit the market. You mentioned Dish is the most likely. Is there anything else to be paying attention
Well,
to?
for the first time, I think we'll have an auction at the end by the end of the year with the AWS-3, small number of licenses, material to some of the companies, but I don't think you're going to see a major change in it. The big question is whether in the reconciliation tax bill, they can work out something in which the Department of Defense agrees to allow the auctioning of some portion of the 3.1 to 3.45 so-called lower three band. But I don't know that I would look. First of all, the auction won't occur for a number of years. And then secondly, given that 5G from a revenue perspective turned out to be pretty disappointing for the carriers, I don't know that they're going to be excited about spending tens of billions of dollars on new spectrum to offer 6G or something like that. But spectrum is definitely important. There are various things that'll be very interesting at the FCC in which Musk will attempt to get the FCC to change some of the rules to allow Starlink to offer a more robust service, have greater capacity. That could affect the competitive dynamic a little bit at the margins in less densely populated areas. But I think those are kind of the big things.
Do you think that will be open to other low Earth orbit, or will they be trying to do it in an exclusive way for a SpaceX? And do you think they'll be successful if they try to do it that
Yeah,
way?
no, it's there's a concept at the FCC known as purple cowing an item. What that means is you write the item as if it's generic and it affects every similarly situated entity, but in fact, it is narrowly targeted. And this is what I meant about the thing I referred to earlier. When Carr wrote the letter to Disney, he said Disney is unique because what they're essentially doing is taking money from local affiliates and subsidizing they're streaming video, and that's bad. Well, number one, Disney isn't unique. Comcast has a very similar business model, so does CBS, right? And Disney may be more successful, but they're not unique. Number two, for a government official to say that an entity should not cross-subsidize within their corporation, that's a very tricky thing. I don't know that I agree. It could be that the subsidy is going the other way, right? I mean, these things are really complicated. But the point is, you could see them doing a similar kind of purple cow. Oh yeah, this is for all LEOs, but as it turns out, Musk is the only one that really can take advantage of it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Amazon is much more successful. They're definitely behind, but they could be successful, and then that could change things too.
Right.
But I should say the real value of the LEOs is what it does in the world context. Its impact on the world is much bigger than its impact on the U.S.
One last thing I wanted to note, if we had time, which we barely do, is on competitive intensity. I had a 20-year-old car I've been driving. It's our second car, and the windshield wipers weren't working. And there was a point in a major driving 70 miles an hour in a major downpour when I had no windshield wipers that I was like, this is not a way to die. And so we now have an EV. In the course of going to the dealerships, I came across this dealership half mile away from an interstate, south suburb of St. Paul, fairly developed area. And when they put in their charging stations at the EV, they didn't work. And they realized it was because they don't really have Verizon service in this area for mobile, because these things all use mobile airwaves. They put in AT&T, it works just fine. And this is, I think, one of the things that I don't think will come out of 2025 with any major changes on this, but it would be nice to me if we would have some acknowledgement from the Federal Communications Commission that all of its data is a fiction about where internet service works, mobile service, fixed service, and we had a real effort. I don't foresee that happening, but one of the things that we may see, we don't really know what competitive intensity is happening because we don't really know where service actually is to a significant degree, I think.
You're hitting a sore subject for me. I talk to a lot of people privately. I'm not going to reveal those conversations, but I did a project for California that basically suggested the number one task of the PUC is to become the authoritative source of information about the information economy in California. That was what I was suggesting the FCC should become. Jessica Rosenworcel has no interest in this. I don't think Brendan Carr has an interest in this. It's one of those kind of, you have to be a real institutionalist to understand how, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been essential to lots of things, including Wall Street. It would be great if there was an institution that, as to the information economy, did the same thing. It would be great if it were the FCC. I don't think it's going to be. Could be Department of Commerce, could be others, but this is, we suggested a number of things in the National Broadband Plan. You have to have a certain amount of political, I don't want to use the word courage, but I would use the word backbone, because it is not in the interest of the companies for anybody else to understand what they're doing. And I understand that from a Wall Street perspective. But at the end of the day, I think the public interest demands good data.
Yeah, Adam Smith recognized this. It's not new,
right?
And it's not. It's a matter of markets will work better if people know where there's a lack of service and an opportunity to invest in things like that.
Part of the reason BEAD is viewed as an unsuccessful program is after 3 years, no money was spent. Most of that time was caught up in the FCC doing maps.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is, there are two companies that have great maps, Google and Apple. Because their phones are dominant, and because their phones not only track where the Wi-Fi is, they track where the connect. They know everything, but the government could not figure out how to get their maps.
Yeah,
and we could have cut 2 years out of the process if we had just gotten what the private sector. And I work mostly in the private sector. Believe me, the private sector has much better information about where there are good networks and where there aren't.
Yeah. Well, 2025, let's see. It's time to get going, or no, it's time to move on, time to get going. What lies ahead? I have no way of knowing. You've suggested we have a significant idea about what lies ahead. So we shall see. And I look forward to reevaluating with you in December, which I think will feel like it's about 6 weeks from now when it finally happens.
Chris, always good to see you. Love your show, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Blair. Thanks for coming on again.
All right. Thank you.
We have transcripts for this and other podcasts available at communitynets.org/broadbandbits. Email us at podcast@communitynets.org with your ideas for the show. Follow Chris on Blue Sky. His handle is @SportShotChris. Follow CommunityNets.org stories on Blue Sky. The handle's @CommunityNets. Subscribe to this and other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. You can access them anywhere you get your podcasts. You can catch the latest important research from all of our initiatives if you subscribe to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount keeps us going. Thank you to Arnie Huseby for the song Warm Duck Shuffle, licensed through Creative Commons.